Greetings. I'm William Kentridge in my studio in Johannesburg, and I send all my best wishes to all of you at the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, and to say how delighted I am that my work is being shown in your museum, and I'm very sorry not to be personally with you in the museum. This is an exhibition which has traveled from the Royal Academy in London, and the hope is that here in Taipei, the exhibition will still make sense to you. Whenever one has an exhibition, there's always an element of translation. Not only a translation of language, but also a translation of associations. There's a translation of associations. You have the work, you have a drawing that comes towards you, but onto this drawing you project all the associations you have with what you see. So you have an image of a horse, but onto this image of a horse, you project all the horses in your head, tang horses, horses you've seen in illustrations, and that combination of what comes towards you and what you bring towards it is what constitutes the entire work. So my hope is that here, in a very different context to where the work was made in Johannesburg, there are some my hope is that there are some associations that are familiar, that we would all share, but that there are others that are particular and different, associations you would have with the works that I wouldn't have. And I hope that this makes for an interesting translation. There are some works on the exhibition that are very indebted to Chinese pictorial traditions, to the great tradition of vegetable and flower paintings in ink, and I hope that my ink paintings are not an embarrassment to all of you who are not an embarrassment to all of you who are at the exhibition. Again, I would like to firstly give my apologies. My apologies for not being with you in person, to give my best wishes for all of you attending the exhibition, and finally to say thank you. Thank you.
各位来宾，大家午安。首先感谢艺术家威廉·肯特里奇特别准备这支幽默风趣的祝福影片，也感谢大家莅临台北市立美术馆参加威廉·肯特里奇展览开幕座谈。本次展览由台北市立美术馆与英国伦敦皇家艺术学院合作策划。今天的座谈邀请到重量级学者与展览的策展人进行专题演讲及对谈。在座谈开始之前，我们请台北市立美术馆王俊杰馆长上台致辞。
我仅代表台北市立美术馆欢迎所有今天莅临William Kentridge 大展开幕座谈的所有的嘉宾。这个展览的筹办呢，对于美术馆来说是一个非常艰辛的过程。我们从2015年就开始规划要做 William Kentridge 的展览，但是当中经过了非常的波折，然后再来就是经过疫情等等的影响，所以我们到了今天终于能够把这个展览呈现给大家。那当然其中有非常重要的一个契机，就是在2015年之后，我们探访了世界各地重要的William Kentridge 的展览的机会，然后在2022年的时候，在伦敦皇家艺术学院有一个William Kentridge 的大展。那这个展览跟我们以前看过的其他的 William Kentridge 的展览不太一样，它非常更有脉络性的从他的绘画为出发去谈这个艺术家的重要性。 那我们在台湾，我想大家对于南非的文化或历史或许不是那么的熟悉，或许我们可以透过这一次的机会，透过 William Kentridge 他很精彩的艺术作品的呈现，去表现他对于南非他的故乡、他的土地的文化跟历史的一个表达。那我们知道南非它从1948到1995是种族隔离政策。那 William Kentridge 他主要的创作的这个开始，大概也是在80年代受到大家的瞩目。那整个作品里面充满了他对于历史文化的一些非常精彩的诠释。那我想非常荣幸啊，这一次可以跟英国伦敦皇家艺术学院共同合作啊。那当然经过了多年之后，从2022年到现在，其实我们在这个伦敦的展览之后，事实上所有的作品都还给了不同的收藏家，所以我们等于是要重启这个展览的时候，大家可以想象，我们必须要经过全球的借鉴。大家知道全球借鉴是什么概念吗？就是分散在全世界各地的收藏家，我们要一个一个的去跟他借作品。当然，其中有部分的作品没有办法，如当初在伦敦展览的时候的那个样子来啊。那所以在南非约翰尼斯堡的William Kentridge 的工作室，还有他的 studio，给我们非常大力的协助。然后，所以我们这次在展场里面也可以看到很多件当初其实没有在伦敦的这个展览里面呈现的啊，甚至于是第一次发表的啊。那所以我们非常的高兴啊，这次除了可以跟皇家艺术学院合作之外，也得到了 William Kentridge 本人的大力的支持。那非常可惜，这一次 William 他不能够亲自来到台北，但是在2个礼拜以前，我在威尼斯双年展有碰到他啊，然后他表达非常兴奋，就是终于可以有作品啊，而且是一个完整的作品来到台湾。我们知道在2年前曾经在国际纪录片双年展有播放他的大部分的动画影片，那但是大家其实还是可能在台湾第一次这么完整的看到他的一个全方位的创作。我们知道 William 他的创作不仅仅是我们比较熟悉的动画跟素描啊，甚至于他有很多的雕塑，还有舞台设计啊，甚至于还有剧场的作品，都非常非常的精彩。那我们从作品里面也可以感受到这样的一个氛围。那这次我真的要非常谢谢伦敦艺术学院的Adrian Locke 策展人，他大力的协助我们。然后我们同时北美馆也有共同的策展人吴兆莹女士啊，跟 Andre 一起来做这个展览。那另外我们今天的这个座谈会也很荣幸的邀请到我们专辑作者啊，那他目前是美国麻萨诸塞大学的特聘教授这个 Stefan Clingman。那其实他从小也是在南非长大的，所以他也是 William Kentridge 的研究的专家。那今天我想透过这个演讲的座谈，大家应该可以更深刻的去认识William Kentridge 他的一个创作的历程。那我想接下来我就邀请北美馆这次展览的共同策展人吴兆莹女士来为我们介绍一下这个展览跟2位即将上台的讲者。谢谢。
大家好，我们美术馆跟伦敦皇家艺术学院一起合作这个展的时候，我们其实就针对这个展览策展人他所提出的这个策展理念，我们觉得非常非常的感动，希望这样子的一个论述概念能够带到台湾来。那这一次呢，我们非常荣幸的也邀请到我们这一次专辑的著作学者Clingman 教授。最主要是他这一篇文章其实跟世界其他地方研究 William Kentridge 的一个角度其实是非常不同的，而且他的用字遣词以及 精辟的分析能力，是让每一件作品它的分析都非常能够令人深刻的理解到 William 他创作的一个企图。那我这里简单介绍一下Stephen Clingman 教授，他是美国麻萨诸塞大学阿默斯特分校的荣誉特聘教授。那他其实在学校里面很重要的一件事情，就是他在2010年、2017年的时候，创立了跨领域的艺术跨领域的研究所。那这一件事情其实也透露出他作为一个学者，他对跨领域怎么从艺术文化这些领域当中去了解透析到更深层的意义的这个企图心。那所以他其实在学校有获得最高的荣誉哦，就是等于是学校非常器重他这一个部分的一个贡献跟成就。那克里曼教授其实最重要是他的文学批评著作，就是写关于有关南非作家诺贝尔得主的纳丁葛蒂娜女士的专书。那这本专书其实受到很多的重视，然后也翻译成很多文章。那我们这次的专辑，我们也非常荣幸，第一次把克里曼教授他的这篇精辟的文章，其实有2篇精辟的文章能够翻译成中文。那我想对于国内很多希望能够认识William Kentridge 的爱好者，能够更深入的了解他。那我们今天教授的一个议题，其实讲到的就是硬边界的这个问题，就是每一个人其实不论是外界或是自己，其实都有一个边界或是一个硬边界的一个概念存在，也就是不可跨越的。可是他从这个点来看 ，William Kentridge 如何去跨越，如何去消解这样子的一个不必要的一个隔离哦。那所以它其实里面有很有趣的一个譬喻跟引申，所以希望大家在这次的一个座谈会当中得到很多的心得。另外策展人呢 Adrian Locke 博士，他在2001年从英国 Essex 大学毕业以后，他就已经进入了伦敦华夏艺术学院开始策展。那他其实办过非常多大型的展览，例如说大家耳熟能详的安妮斯卡布，还有艾未未，还有这次的William Kentridge。其实可以看出他对于跨领域或是跨文化的艺术表达这件事情，他是他内心里面很重视的一件事情哦。那从大展到更小的一个文化探索，其实都是他非常中心关注的一个议题哦。那这一次我们在跟那个跟 Locke 讨论到这个策展的一个概念的时候，其实他特别提出一个他世界各地William Kentridge 展览所比较少见的，就是回归到所谓的素描这件事情，就是作为一个艺术家，他用他的手，他用他的身体，用线条最简单的一个素材去表达一个人的一些思维跟美学空间哦。那这一点其实我们在我们的展场上一定可以看到更多大家的一个不同的体会。那我们现在就先鼓掌欢迎 Stephen Clingman 教授上台，谢谢。
Well, thank you, Chao Ying, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be here with you, to see such a full room of people who are clearly enthusiastic about the work of William Kentridge. It means a great deal to me, and I'm sure to Adrian Locke as well. And I do want to just repeat some of the thanks that I expressed the other evening to people here at TFAM, just for the kindness and graciousness and efficiency of everything they do. A credit to the director and everybody who works with him. And it's been a true pleasure for me. It's also, I have to say how grateful I am to William Kentridge himself and the staff and his collaborators in his studio who've extended every kindness to me in doing the work that I've done and really made everything available to me that I could possibly have wanted. And I hope you will see some of that in the slides that I show today. I'm also very happy to be here together with Adrian Locke, who produced such a splendid, magnificent show at the Royal Academy, and how wonderful it is that it's moved here. And of course, I'm grateful to the people I worked with at the Royal Academy as well on the catalogue, and such a pleasure to see the catalogue here too. It looks magnificent. I hope you will go out and buy one if you haven't already. And lastly, a thank you to people who do the important work of interpretation and translation. Everything I say is being translated here today, and I do appreciate it very much. And of course, there were translators involved in the catalogue as well. So, let me begin. In William Kentridge's recent Slade lectures, which he presented at Oxford University in January and February of this year, he reflects on one of his most extraordinary works, Waiting for the Sybil. In doing so, he recounts how his first idea of how to make the piece, which was undoubtedly a good idea, gave way to other ideas in the process of making it, a matter of vision, materials, happenstance, reformulation. Kentridge remarks that in the face of such changes, one can hold on to the first idea, even as cracks begin to open up and the idea loses stability. Or, he says, one can give the cracks their space to allow these ideas from the lacunae, the interstices, to have their say and shape the thought. These are the less good ideas. There are at least three relevant points revealed in this statement. One is Kentridge's notion of the less good idea. Not the idea one begins with first, but the one that emerges, less good on the face of it, perhaps more challenging, but in the end, more productive. This notion is an adaptation of a Tswana proverb, South African proverb, first recorded by the great South African writer and political leader Sol Plaatje in the early years of the 20th century. If the good doctor cannot cure you, find the less good doctor. It's a great little saying. It also underlies the name and philosophy of the center Kentridge founded in downtown Johannesburg, the Center for the Less Good Idea, a space for experimental and improvisational performances of all kinds. Here, less good ideas have a home and a space for development. That's one point then that emerges. The second is Kentridge's radical openness to metamorphosis and transformation in all its forms, from good ideas to less good ideas, from one kind of material to another, from one vision of a piece to another, from a charcoal outline on the paper to its alteration. Patterns that I want to explore further today. The third point is very much related to these first two. And following Kentridge's lead, it's one I want quite literally to open up. Here again is how Kentridge puts it. One can give the cracks their space to allow these ideas from the lacunae, the interstices, to have their say and shape the thought. Implicit here is the idea of the space, the gap between things, as a fundamental and generative space. It is where the dynamic of the work comes from. This may be the source of the metamorphoses and transformations Kentridge's work is not only prepared to contemplate, but to explore and delight in, to use as the very ground of his particular form of creativity. In ways I want to explain, I would like to refer to these gaps, these cracks, as boundary spaces across which the spark of creativity occurs. It has been in being prepared not only to cross those spaces, but in a sense to enter into and live in them, that art itself is generated. In thinking about these things, I want to get closer to what I would call the generative grammar of Kentridge's work. Now, of course, no explanation could be total or complete, least of all mine. I doubt that even William Kentridge could give a complete explanation of his own work. There's also the matter of brilliance, or what we might deservedly call genius, that quite simply cannot be explained. The kind that can put a specific mark on the page or conceive of that opera or film. That's a matter of gift, underscored by a kind of living allegiance, art as a dwelling place. But these other matters also seem to me significant. In Kentridge's work, the boundary, which we normally think of as a line or a limit, becomes a space that opens up. And it also alters, it becomes a space of movement, communication, and transformation. And this idea, I hope it's the less good idea, but this idea will be central to my remarks today. To set the scene, however, let me begin with Kentridge's background, the world that he grew up in, very much the world that I grew up in as well, as I grew up in Johannesburg like William Kentridge, not far from where he lived, in fact. Because this has some bearing, this was the world of apartheid, a world that proposed a rigid separation between the races, black and white, and it applied in every sector of life, labor and employment, housing and living areas, schooling and education, culture and religion. Moreover, it was a matter not only of horizontal separation, keeping people apart, but also of vertical hierarchy. In blunt terms, whites were on top, and black South Africans and members of other races in a regimented system below. In practice, the lines of separation were often breached, and blacks and whites did encounter one another in various forms on a daily basis. But in terms of the theory, and in many ways of the practice, this was the world of the hard boundary, of severe separation, the epitome of the wall or limit. Identity was based on which side of the line you were on, this side or that side, where you could live, how much you could earn, which hospital or ambulance you could use, where you would go to school, what you would learn, where you would be buried. That was it. Fate, identity, from birth to death. And the living boundaries involved psychological boundaries as well. The history of this version of the boundary is one reason why I want to see what Kentridge offers in his work. In this context, both of Kentridge's parents were anti-apartheid lawyers. His father, Sidney, later Sir Sidney Kentridge, acted for the defense in some of the famous political trials of the era. His mother, Felicia Kentridge, was a co-founder of the Legal Resources Center, which aided individuals and communities oppressed by apartheid's laws. And you can see them here in this photograph, along with one of the most famous legal and political figures of South Africa, a man named Bram Fischer. Now, William Kentridge himself could have been a superb lawyer like his parents. At school, the school that I went to as well, he was a successful member of the debating team, and that's one form of preface, often, to a legal career. But as he put it, when he realized that in a debate, you could take either side of a case and argue it with equal facility, he began to be less satisfied with purely rational forms of exposition. At university, he studied political science and African studies, and the University of the Witwatersrand, again, the university I went to as well, in those days was a hotbed of political activity. Kentridge took to drama and performance as co-founder of the Junction Avenue Theatre Company, and some of his first public artworks were posters advertising its productions. And here are a couple of examples. He also participated in the political demonstrations of the time, including the student protests and marches on June the 16th, 1976, in solidarity with the Soweto uprising by school pupils in Soweto, the black township near Johannesburg. Excuse me, and this was a momentous event in South African history. And here's a rare photograph of William, and you can see him outlined in red over there, and his wife, Anne Stanix, at the head of that student march. Now, I was in that march, but I wasn't at the front. I was somewhere towards the back, I think. But in this context, where was Kentridge's place? What form would his art and commitment take? In this, there were a number of puzzles and paradoxes. He was certainly anti-apartheid, yes, but how could one make art in this setting? How could it be relevant to the struggles of black workers and students? What was one's place as a white student in these structures? Later, these issues became even more intense. If apartheid was an all-encompassing system, so too the politics that opposed it could become rigidly systematic and demanding, especially in relation to the cultural sphere. By the 1980s, an organ known as the Cultural Desk, allied with the African National Congress, the leader of the liberation movement in South Africa, demanded certain forms of conformity from artists, writers, and musicians. How could one make one's own space in such a context, especially given the kind of art Kentridge was drawn to? Could it be that he found himself between two regimes of seeing, each sealed and hermetic in its own way, without knowing how to navigate between them? Feeling somewhat paralyzed, Kentridge stopped making art from 1981 to 1984. He was adrift in that in-between space. But it turns out that the space between, the gap, can also be liberating if one embraces it. Could one widen the boundary in which one found oneself? Kentridge turned to what he instinctively was drawn to in every sense. He focused on the image, the images as they would come to him. Let the image decide the topic and the approach. As he put it, give the image the benefit of the doubt. And as for a different quandary, the imperative to oppose apartheid politically, that could be resolved through art itself. Kentridge was drawn to forms of art that merged the political with the formally inventive. Soviet artists of the 1920s before Stalinism closed everything down, German expressionism, the 1930s, and the Neue Sachlichkeit. His early work showed these influences in a specifically South African inflection, as we see in these extraordinary works from the 1980s. And you can see some of Kentridge's triptychs in the current exhibition. This is one of them, called Embarkation. And this is one which actually is on display here, Caspers Full of Love. Now, Caspers were the armored cars that went carrying police and soldiers through the black townships. And this was William's response to that. But interesting to note that he was focused not only on the politics, but was drawn by various artistic influences in staging this image. So where the law of Kentridge's parents had its own appeal and imperative, he found a way of finding in art a form of the creative and exploratory that followed its own laws, an exhilarating and enlivening form of work. This was work that proposed not definition and answer, but the play of question, disruption, and doubt. If apartheid's philosophy of the boundary was a living absurdity, let an art of the absurd undermine it. Find a form of expression that did not follow political prescription, but found its own prescriptions for South African pathology. Though Kentridge didn't yet know the phrase, art was the less good doctor, because the good doctor certainly could not cure the morbidity around him. So, inhabiting the space between law and art, between regimes of seeing, between one world and another, between present, past, and future, this became a kind of living space for Kentridge. And in a way, it's where he's lived as an artist ever since. There were other personal dimensions. In his Slade lectures, Kentridge commented on his Jewish background. William would attend Friday night synagogue services with his grandfather, but the Hebrew was a mystery to him. There was a kind of intelligible, unintelligible meaning in it. By the same token, he was surrounded by African languages he didn't understand, a river of sound he never quite entered. The school he went to, an all-white, all-boys school, was determinedly Anglo-colonial. Englishness, Jewishness, and Africanness circled round one another in his life, but never quite connected. One can put it this way: like the languages he heard but didn't speak, the space Kentridge inhabited was one of translation, but one in which the translation was never completed. It was a state of intranslatability. But again, such a state could be not so much a problem, but a kind of solution. Kentridge draws on a Jewish tradition to make the point. God understands the words of the prayers, yet devotion comes not from the words themselves, but from the spaces between the words. This is a space of a different kind, a different version of translation, impossible to define, but palpable in its own way. And Kentridge draws a personal conclusion. A love of gaps, yes, that shows who I am. A love of gaps. So the problem becomes the solution. More than that, the problem becomes a solution as a problem to be explored. The love of gaps, living in undecidability, living in the space between, working in the space between, making that the ground of one's work, that, in a sense, is where Kentridge operates all the time. So this is how we can understand the boundary, not as the wall, but as an area of encounter and navigation. And as a small aid, I have a couple of diagrams. This is a very simple diagram of the boundary as a wall. It's just a hard line, the hard line of apartheid. But I think what William shows in his work, and what I'm much more interested in, is the boundary as a space, and that we're always moving through time and space in relation to one another. And I think that's the space that he lives in. And in this space, the boundary does not prevent movement and expression, but rather provokes it, becoming the site of its most meaningful explorations. Everything happens in that space. And here we can use language as an analogy. For art is a kind of language. Language, expression, and meaning depend on space, the space between. Language combines words, that's how it operates. But without the space between words and the connection from one word to another as we speak our sentences, nothing happens. And language, when it's used, occurs in space, the space between one speaker and another, between myself today, as I'm speaking to you, and you, as listeners, making your own sense of what I say. Without space, there would be no point in speaking, and quite possibly no way to talk. Today, there's an added dimension because my words in English are being translated. The Latin origins of the word translation actually mean to carry across. And that too is what metaphor means in Greek. So language carries across. Language is always a form of translation, whether we're speaking the same language or not. And that's true of art as well, as William himself said in his welcome greeting today. Except that Kentridge has found his own way of making art as he operates across modes, media, times, spaces, and translations. So let's see more concretely how this works, beginning with Kentridge's primary mode as an artist, the charcoal drawing. More particularly, let us think of charcoal itself. So charcoal is a substance produced by metamorphosis, the burning of wood. Its thickness as an instrument can vary, but one thing for sure is that charcoal does not make sharp lines. Indeed, as charcoal is applied to paper, especially if that paper has its own texture, the black of the charcoal edges into white, the white of the paper edges into black, and in short, we have the opposite of the hard boundary. One can think of this almost allegorically in the context of apartheid. Against the system of hard boundaries, Kentridge uses a medium that alters the very nature of the boundary. And I'm sure he was not drawn to charcoal because of allegory. It was his natural medium, always more comfortable for him than oil paint. But he does draw conclusions about charcoal which have epistemological as well as artistic implications. That is, they involve questions of what we know and how we know it. As he puts it, one reason he is attracted to charcoal is because of what he calls, and I'm quoting, the indeterminacy of the point. Instead of offering the clear line, the definitive answer, charcoal, in the very nature of its marks, suggests possibility, transition, metamorphosis. And this is true of the larger point of Kentridge's drawing in general. As he puts it, again I'm quoting, "My work is about a process of drawing that tries to find a way through the space between what we know and what we see." Between what we know and what we see. The space between is essential to Kentridge's art. It's the place where art happens. But there's more to it than that, because in Kentridge's drawings he will frequently erase the lines that he has drawn or blur them using a cloth or sprinkle charcoal dust on the drawing, which has its own effect. By this means, a certain animation enters into the drawing, marked as the history of its past, because the past remains registered there as a memory. And so we have a malleable boundary in time, the time of the drawing, as well as space. This is even more pronounced in Kentridge's films, what he calls drawings for projection, where erasure and redrawing are intrinsic to his method. Now, as virtually everyone knows by now, this is how he does it. Kentridge will draw the image, then photograph it, then erase or alter the outline, and photograph it again. Ultimately, all these transformations make up the animated film, as we can see in this video I made in 2020 when I happened to be in William's studio. So actually I made that video in 2020 because I was there to work on the catalogue, which became the Royal Academy catalogue, and later the catalogue that is here. Here's another example of how it works. I've separated out some stills from a film called Stereoscope of Williams, and these are stills of a cat becoming a bomb. So you can look at the stages here. And then the bomb explodes. And it's really interesting, if you see them all together, to realize that when William makes these pictures and changes them, he's actually destroying his pictures in the moment of making them. So they disappear in time and space as well. And it is a form of sacrifice, but one that produces the moving work at the end. So from this point of view, as you can see here, there's no easy opposition between the still, the image that is photographed, and the film, because as we've seen, animation enters into the still, while the film is made up of a succession of still images. And in this process, there's another dimension in the malleability of time. As Kentridge points out, using this method, it can take 1,500 photographs or 1,500 frames for 1 minute of projected film. And it can take 9 months to make a 9-minute film. Time in this aspect is not like the ticking of a clock, but rather becomes both stretched and concentrated. There are in effect different clocks here, both concealed and revealed in the making of the film. In short, in Kentridge's films, we have a version of relativity in the malleable boundaries of time itself, quite a remarkable feature. There are other facets to this. In Kentridge's drawings for projection, which is what he calls these films, drawings for projection, and indeed for all his film work, as he said, there's no storyboard giving clear outlines to the narrative or the plot. For most films, most people who make films have a storyboard which maps out the story in advance. But for Kentridge, one animation of the image gives rise to another, as the artist is led by the line rather than drawing according to any clear plan or intention. As an experiential matter, the artist lives in a place of discovery and uncovering as the work itself evolves. This in itself is a kind of space in making the work, a place of navigation between the banks of departure and arrival. And if it's a slow process requiring patience and trust, it also means the notion of destination, where you're going, must live in a state of suspension. We might say, with equal emphasis on both words, of suspended animation. But if the artist lives in undefined space, so too does the artwork, as it is seen by viewers. They bring their meanings to it, it brings all its suggestions to them. Meaning is made in the space between artist, the art, and the viewers. And this is true too across the multiple forms and genres Kentridge has turned his hand to over the years. It's quite a list. He's worked in etching, in dry point, in theatre, in opera, in film, puppetry, tapestry, sculpture, collage. The key point about all these forms, however, is that they are in a perpetual conversation and dialogue with one another in his work. We've already seen this. The still image becomes the projection. The film is made of still drawings, which are all already animated. But is the film not also a form of theatre? With Kentridge's characteristic characters, Soho Eckstein and Felix Teitelbaum, and again you'll see some of these films in the exhibition here. Here's some images of Soho Eckstein from films you'll see in the exhibition and from different stages in their evolution. This is one of the earlier films, and there is Soho as the mining magnate, the person in charge of the world. This, some decades later, is Soho looking into what looks like a grave. This comes from City Deep, and there's an air of melancholy and complicity about it. So even though the character is the same, he's moved through space, moved through time, and become a different kind of person. So there's change there. And if you add music to the films, the films then become like an opera. And as for Kentridge's theatre and opera productions, they always involve projections of his drawings. The characters on stage in these productions often take the form of human sculptures. This is an image from the opera Lulu, one of Williams' productions, which shows that point. You can see the drawings on the screens behind the actors. The actors are almost like sculptures there. And so many of Kentridge's sculptures that he actually makes often involve movement, but even when the sculpture is still, sometimes it's the movement of the viewer that's required to see it, as in his so-called shattered sculptures. These are sculptures which look shattered, broken up from one perspective, but become complete from another. Here again is an example of what I mean. This is a video I made in 2020 again. Morning. So you can see that as you move around the sculpture, it becomes a different kind of being, a different kind of thing. So some of Kentridge's sculptures, his glyphs as he calls them, invoke language, as in this formation called lexicon. And these are figures, but it looks as if they make a sentence of some kind, as if they're words in a sentence. Something I'm sure makes special sense in this setting here. So sometimes these small sculptures, evolve to enormously large-scale sculptures. Or a sculpture in metal, making no obvious sense on its own, will project a tree from one side and a typewriter from another when illuminated from two different directions. And I think this is just an extraordinary piece. You've got light from two different directions projected through the same sculpture, and on the one hand you see a tree, and on the other hand a typewriter. Quite remarkable, the calculation that has to go into making that kind of thing. And so this is a double drawing or projection in light and shadow. Movement intrinsically is part of this. Space is also part of it. And there's a kind of theater in this, the relation between typewriter and tree, which is absolutely dependent on the gap, difference, and the connections we make. So, how are we to understand all of this? It's a prodigious array, and certainly brilliance and even genius is there, as I've suggested. So are daring and courage, the commitment to follow the evolving idea through so that its immanent form, the form seemingly contained within it, becomes realized and visible. But in the terms I've been setting out, we can also understand this as different modes communicating with and through one another across space, the drawing with the film, the projection with the opera, the performance with the sculpture. So too, Kentridge will use different forms of music in his productions. He'll use Mozart, Hindemith, and Stockhausen, juxtaposed with African church brass bands or music from the Congo, or pieces composed by his extraordinary group of South African collaborators who work with him in his studio. From my perspective, I think the key issue is that these different forms aren't simply merged or mushed together with one another to the point where they become indistinguishable, a kind of aesthetic jumble. Rather, they keep their individuality, but they combine with one another to make something different, a composite or a collage of some kind. And again, it's the boundary between them that opens up to become the very space of the composite formation. In an interesting way, something that interests me in particular, this is a formal exploration of questions of identity, so important in our current world. Identity as such, the identity of any particular medium or form in the compilation, is not dissolved or negated in the artwork, but is able to contribute in and of itself to the dynamic of the whole. One could wish that the world would see human identities in this way too. We do not need to give up our individual identities in the human combination or collage. Our identities, if we're honest with ourselves, are already forms of collage. And I think recognizing that would help us all produce a more peaceable world. Carrying on with William, there are also his large projects, which also deserve exposition. And it's an exposition Kentridge himself has given, again, in his Slade lectures, which I highly recommend to everybody, and you can find them online. And I'm using them quite a bit today. Let me turn to one called Triumphs and Laments. This was a work Kentridge mounted in Rome on the banks of the Tiber River in 2016. The invitation had come sometime earlier to create a frieze on the walls of those banks, and Kentridge devised an ingenious method of doing so. Over the course of centuries, the walls had become covered in grime, and the idea was to make stencils to cover the walls and then power wash them so that the non-image would be cleaned away, while the grime that remained would create the dark areas of the image. And here you get a sense of what it is, but I'll show a video also where you'll see it up close. As Kentridge puts it, linking the connection between drawing and erasure in his work, the process would, quote, erase the frieze onto the walls of the Tiber. It would erase the frieze onto the walls of the Tiber. But much had to be done, and transformation was at the heart of it. What began as a 35-centimeter drawing in the studio became a 10-meter high stencil for the power washing. One might think of a wall, the wall of the Tiber, as the epitome of a boundary. But let us think too how through this process the river bank became a living space for all these transformations. Moreover, space became a literal part of the project. Kentridge records how, with a degree of personal shock, he came to recognize the topography of Rome itself in a different way. On one side of the Tiber were St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican, and all the glories they housed. This is showing, the circle there shows where Triumphs and Laments was placed. But this is the geography of Rome over there. So on the one side you've got the Vatican up there, and on the other side, down there, see if I can find it, I'm at an angle here, the Jewish ghetto, which had a long history of oppression and was a site of the notorious roundup of its inhabitants by Mussolini in 1943. And as Kentridge puts it, if you draw a line from St. Peter's to the ghetto, it would almost bisect the frieze he was making. I was so interested when I heard him say this that I went and found the maps and saw how accurate it is, that if you draw this line from St. Peter's to the ghetto, it goes right through where Triumphs and Laments was created. So the space between, on the walls of the Tiber, became the literal site of the work. The wall was the space between. And what was the connection between these two places? How were they two different facets of the same history? As Kentridge understood all too well, South Africa had its own version of this, in which history and shame were profoundly connected. And so the project became one of linkage across these geographical and historical spaces. Triumphs and Laments became the concept. The triumph of one is the lament of the other. And this was registered in every aspect of the piece, not only in its images, but in its enaction and performance, as theatre, as opera. Two processions would approach one another on the banks of the Tiber, alongside its walls. One procession, carrying its cut-out banners, was like a triumph from imperial Rome. The other was the record of those who suffered under imperial Rome. Lighting would project the shadows of both processions onto the Tiber walls, the walls which already had the shadowed images of the frieze upon them. Light and darkness were intrinsically connected, something represented in the very form and materials of the work. Topography became topic, became theme, and the present too was included. Among the images was one of current-day refugees making their way by boat to Europe. So here's a brief video excerpt from the event. You can see for yourself what an extraordinary production it was. An amazing piece of work, as you can see. So let me focus then on one other project that crosses boundaries in extraordinary ways, and that's Kentridge's chamber opera, Waiting for the Sybil, which I began by discussing in this lecture, and the film of which you can see in the exhibition here. So once again, Rome and South Africa are the geographical and cultural polarities. And once again, time, deep time in this instance, comes into the framework. The thematic premise concerns the Sybil of Cumae, the prophetess of classical times, whose cave was located just outside present-day Naples. According to legend, the Sybil would write the fates of individuals on oak leaves and place them within her cave. People would come to find out their fate, but as soon as the door to the cave opened, a wind would blow the leaves about. The fate was accurate, but there was no telling which fate was yours. The legend of the Sybil comes up in Virgil's Aeneid, as well as in Dante, and more indirectly, James Joyce. Michelangelo gives the iconic visual rendition of the Sybil in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So how was Kentridge to work his own version? And in this case, in an amazing leap of connection, the Sybil became the figure of an African sangoma, a visionary or seer caught in the throes of ecstatic, yet also ominous dance, the kind that, according to tradition, attends the presence of the ancestors. Oak leaves would flood the film, as would trees revolving like the dancer revolving and turning like the trees. Kentridge has for a long time been interested in trees as figures of metamorphosis and fate. Trees produce the paper the artist works on. The artist works on leaves of paper. That might be one reason why the images in the film of Kentridge's Sybil take place on the shimmering leaves of a book. And here are a couple of stills showing that. Most of these pages that we see in the book are from a dictionary. What do our words mean? What do they foretell? And some of them are from Dante's Purgatorio and Paradiso, with its own prophecy of eventual redemption, bathed in the film in a mystical wash of blue. So let me show you an excerpt from the film so you can see for yourself. So that's just an excerpt, and I have to say, to me, that's one of the most haunting things that Kentridge has ever done, and I can never see it without being moved. And as you can see, everything is in motion in the film, from the pages of the book to the dancer to the inscrutable messages of fate, ranging from the obscure to the profound. Death is at the heart of it. One omen reads, "Death grows its tree inside you." Another, "Start dying assiduously." Another, "You will never see that city." For death is, after all, the ultimate fate and mystery. We know it is certain, but we don't know how it will come. In a way, it is the ultimate boundary we must cross, but it is also a boundary that is defined by and defines the space of our lives. As Kentridge puts it, this is the terrain we live in. We know the ending, certainly, but in the space before the ending, we have to work as if that ending was not there. The space before the ending. The boundary is not only one we have to cross, but one in which we live, which we are already crossing between our arrival and our leaving. The word leaving, which has all these connotations in English, is appropriate. From then to now, from Africa to Rome, the Sybil has an echo for everyone. So there's so much else in Kentridge's work one could discuss. His opera Notes Towards a Model Opera turns to the Great Leap Forward under Mao in the 1950s. And once again, Kentridge crosses space and time from China then to Africa now. His recent film, Oh, to Believe in Another World, from 2022, is a multimodal reflection on the Russian Revolution, its promise and betrayals, involving, among other things, a miniature stage theatre, actors performing as human sculpture puppets, and documentary film. His opera, The Head and the Load, from 2018, turns to a suppressed and forgotten history of the role of Africans in World War I. Here, in telling a collective story, Kentridge uses history itself as collage, a method that embeds the partial glimpses through which history comes down to us. If anything, these works show us that the gaps I've been speaking of are highly complex and articulated, with all kinds of disjunctions, overlaps, and absences within them, all part of Kentridge's project. As for disjunctions and overlaps, Kentridge himself will often appear doubled or tripled in his films, as we saw in his meeting that began today's event. And these suggest multiplicities and crossings even within the self. In the midst of it, he still makes exquisite drawings, often of trees with enigmatic phrases attached, setting up a different kind of dynamic. So this is what Kentridge has to say, and this is the way he says it in his drawing of all kinds, which is, as he puts it, a kind of thinking, a slow motion version of thought. Vision and art are connected, but if Kentridge has a vision, it is in the first place a vision of art. It is, as I've suggested in the catalogue, a form of liberating vision. In this spirit, let me end with a few thoughts that come from a completely different direction. In recent months, I've been inspired by reading the work of Carlo Rovelli, an Italian theoretical physicist. And if I need any justification for this, there are two. One is that Kentridge himself drew on theoretical physics in his work, The Refusal of Time. So there is good precedent here. The other is that in at least one of Rovelli's books, he takes the greatest Italian poet of all time, Dante, as his guide. So if a physicist can be guided by Dante, I can be guided by a physicist. I won't go into everything Rovelli says as an exponent of of a theory called loop quantum gravity. The quantum world operates on the minutest of subatomic scales, and there's no easy translation to the everyday world. Yet by way of analogy, much of what he says seems to resonate. The key point, I think, is that for Rovelli, reality is always relational, always a matter of interaction. He puts it in phrasing that has an almost uncanny relevance for Kentridge's work. Quote, "It is only in interactions that nature draws the world." It's so interesting that he uses that phrasing. It's only in interaction that nature draws the world. And that's how Kentridge draws the world too, through its interactions. And indeed, for Rovelli, the very nature of things in the world is defined by the relations they enter into. It's not so much the thing that enters into a relation, but a relation that determines the nature of the thing. Even objects that appear to be still are in process all the time. Rovelli quotes the philosopher Nelson Goodman on the nature of objects. An object is a monotonous process. For Kentridge, the object is never monotonous. We've seen how even his still drawings are often in process. The object in Kentridge, whether cat, bomb, bottle opener, or Trotsky, is nothing other than process, nothing other than relation. Rovelli offers a summary of the world as constantly in motion. It is a world of vibrations, a continuous fluctuation, a microscopic swarming of fleeting micro-events. We can think of the shimmering pages of Kentridge's Sybil, but also of all of his work, a continuous vibration, a shifting and swarming of events. Nothing is static. There is no monotony, no monotone in his approach. Everything is in process, emerging from the processes of the studio. In Kentridge's work, we see not so much the world in animation, but what he has called the world as animation. The world is an intrinsically animated place. It is the moving boundary in space and time in which we live. It is the space in which we see the vision and, to introduce a new but apt word here, the magic of William Kentridge's art. Thank you very much.